Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, 10 Ways to Drive Salesforce User Adoption. My name is Diana Hurst. I'm the Director of Marketing at CRM Science. And today we have a lot of great tips and tricks for you coming up. But before we dive in, some of you may not be as familiar with CRM Science, so I want to take a quick moment and give you a quick overview. CRM Science is a Salesforce consulting firm. We are a Salesforce Silver strategic partner. We implement all of Salesforce's clouds and products. We also customize them for companies that are either looking to get started on the platform or that are already on the platform. So we were founded in 2011. Over the past 8 years, we've been very fortunate to work with a variety of industries. We specialize in financial services, insurance, manufacturing, but we've also seen clients of ours have great success that are in other industries, such as senior living and even media. Something that's really unique about CRM Science, I find, is that we are 100% onshore. That means we don't outsource any of the work. We don't even work with subcontractors that are onshore. So our team is made up of full-time dedicated resources, and we all have really deep and wide Salesforce expertise and really understand how to customize and maximize it to companies like yourself that have unique needs. Now, before I introduce all of our presenters today, some housekeeping that I'd like to share with you. We are recording today's webinar, and you will be receiving a replay as well as the slides at the end of the webinar. And also, we have a lot of people on the call today, so you are all muted, but we do recommend that you ask your questions, and to do so, you can use the chat feature in the Zoom control panel. So we encourage you to use that and send us your questions. We will take a moment at the end of the webinar to go through your questions. And if we don't get to your questions, don't worry, because we can always reach out to you after the webinar to answer your question. So here they are, today's presenters. We have a full house. We have Eliza Hammer, who is our Engagement Success Manager. We have Pamela Roller, who's also our Engagement Success Manager. And then we have Philip Bolognini. He is our Salesforce User Experience Designer. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Eliza, who's going to walk us through her favorite tips and tricks. Eliza, are you ready? Oh, Eliza's muted. Hold on.
There we go. Can you guys hear me now? I really appreciate the warm introduction.
Take it away.
All right, so let's get started by first defining what user adoption is. So, user adoption is a term that's thrown around a lot, but really it comes down to a few very important metrics. So first, is our users logging in, right? Are they actually logging into the system and engaging with what you have in Salesforce? Second, are users creating and updating records, right? Are they not only viewing the information that you and your team have put there, but are they also creating their own accounts and contacts where appropriate, right? Or updating data that they know is incorrect? Which leads to, is the data quality high, right? Do you trust that the data that you have in Salesforce is fully accurate, right? Bad data means that people don't trust the system, and often helps user adoption really not get going. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Fourth, are they engaging in your training, right? When you do roll out new features, or when you are training your users on how to use Lightning or something else, that's really high impact, are they engaging with you? Are they asking good questions? Are they excited for the training, right? Or does, getting people to really participate in those sorts of meetings, is that like pulling teeth, right? And lastly, are your users enthusiastic? The thing about Salesforce that I love is that it has some of the most enthusiastic users I've ever worked with, right? User groups, especially the one right here at Philly Force, are huge, and they're doing amazing things. People are so excited about Salesforce that they even put their babies in Salesforce themed onesies, and you can buy all sorts of Salesforce gear on their website. Are your users so in love with the tool that they would go that far? And if the answer is anything other than yes, right, it sounds like you need some help. It sounds like, there's some things that we can do. So Pamela and Phil and I are going to walk through 10 tips for how to drive user adoption. So we're going to try to go rapid fire, and we'll recap at the end. And like Diana said, we'll do our best to leave plenty of time at the end for questions. So tip number one. Tip number one is that ROI starts at the very beginning, right? So there's this Lewis Carroll quote that I love, which is begin at the beginning and go into the end and then stop. So first, right, so what is ROI, right? That's a 3-letter acronym everybody loves. But ROI, right, is your return on investment. So in this world, it means a couple of things. It's not only your investment into Salesforce, right, from a licensing perspective and which tools you use, and are you using some of the additional benefits of the platform like Marketing Cloud and Pardot and those sorts of things, but also it's your projects. Right? Is the work that you're doing within Salesforce, is the way that you are customizing it and investing in it, bearing fruit. So I really strongly believe that ROI begins at the beginning. You really need to work to start building buy-in early. And this is true not only with fresh implementations, right? So a lot of folks at this stage have experience using Salesforce, good, bad, or otherwise. A lot of folks now have used the system in lots of different ways at various organizations. So helping them understand what Salesforce can do for them, what Salesforce can do for your company, right? Or when you're working on a project, why is this the project that your team chose to do next? Why is this the next important thing? It's helpful when folks get that sort of insight early on and they buy into why what you're about to invest in is the next most important thing. That makes everything else easier along the way and makes adoption of that new tool or that new customization even better in the end, right? To summarize it, right? Don't make your project a secret, right? You want to help the rest of your team understand what you're working on, what's coming, get excited about it, because having new and more efficient ways to do what your business does should be a really exciting thing, right? We don't want to just do this big hurrah unveil at the end. Tip number two. So tip number two is all about the source of truth. So we talk about this a lot, right? Is the source of truth is like when somebody has a question, where do they go for the answer? And when Salesforce is well implemented, Salesforce is often the answer to that question. So, but that starts at the top, right? This is a moment where you need to model for the rest of your organization that Salesforce is a trusted source of information. So there's really 3 ways to break down how to make sure that Salesforce is your source of truth. 3 questions to ask. The first is, how are leaders using dashboards and reports? Do they have the dashboards and reports that they need in order to derive useful information from what's in the system? Do your users see that there are reports that their manager, right, or anybody who's considered in a leadership position rely on in order to get helpful information? Right. Second, how many meetings reference Salesforce data? When you're doing your weekly sales review or your monthly account review, are you doing that from a spreadsheet, or is that meeting actually being driven live from a Salesforce dashboard? I would hope that the answer is the latter. And third, are there processes that are still being run in spreadsheets or emails? Right? So we know that Salesforce has many incredible tools like approval processes and case management and forecasting that allow us to take some of these complex processes that we were working, in spreadsheets and Access databases, before, that they can very easily be run directly out of Salesforce. And doing that creates visibility and so on and so forth. So the bottom line here is that when you're investing heavily in Salesforce, user adoption not only comes from actually getting in there and then logging into the system, right? My first question, but also, do you trust the data? And does everyone trust the data? Does everyone see that the leadership of your organization it believes that the data in Salesforce is a source of truth. Our third tip is all about metrics. So I've talked a little bit here about the reports and dashboards, but really, right, it's the metrics matter. And so the metrics help us not only see what's going on with your business, but we can also help build metrics around how users are using the system. So the first is a great tool that we love called Salesforce Adoption Dashboards that helps you measure things like logins and record creation and updates. So this goes back to kind of the very baseline data-driven answer of what is user adoption. There's also some tools we love that help us measure data quality. When we do org cleanup projects, we often start by running a tool called Field Trip, which allows us to see how often custom fields are being used. This is a great way to see, are there fields that you have in there that nobody's using, or that maybe the data, and that suggests, right, that the data quality is very low. Another tool that I really love is data quality scoring. This is another tool, actually a Salesforce lab project that I've adapted and readapted many times. It gives your users a visual way to see when a record is missing key information. So validation rules are great, right, because they stop your users from creating bad data, but what if they honestly don't have the information yet? You want them to still be able to create their records. And a tool like a data quality score gives them a visual indicator that there are records that need their attention and that they need to go back through and fill in more information about. And lastly, it's important to always think about your desired reports and dashboards. When we're designing a data model, right, we want to make sure that you can answer the questions that are most important to you and your organization right out of a Salesforce report. So don't just think about, you know, what do I want to see today or what do I need to see every day, but to know that the system is working well, right, that to go back to my first point, that you're getting good ROI, think about what reports and dashboards would be most helpful to you 30 days post-launch or 180 days post-launch. What are these reports that we can run at those kind of key milestones and make sure that you're getting everything that you expected to get out of your Salesforce solution? So my fourth tip is keep the training coming, right? We often think about training as kind of this one and done approach, but in my experience, that really isn't true. It's really important that we are constantly training and re-engaging our users in what's new in Salesforce, right? Well, another way to put it is to communicate, communicate, communicate. If you've said it once, that's great. Ideally, right, marketing theory tells us that for information to be soaked in, a person has to hear something 7 times and in 7 different ways. So by communicating and over-communicating, that often helps users who learn very differently, right, all learn how to use the tool. The second is Trailhead. So Trailhead is a wonderful free tool from Salesforce that helps users, administrators, developers, all sorts get comfortable using Salesforce. It's free, it's engaging, it's gamified. I really, really love Trailhead, and so does the rest of CRM Science. Next, you want your training to be things that are referenceable later, right? So how do you not just have a great training in one day, but give them something to take away, right? What does your documentation look like? Is it some 100-page, you know, magnum opus that a user really has to cipher through in order to get answers? Or have you built it more like a quick start guide or an FAQ, right? Some sort of documentation that's very easy for users to find answers. I've also had a lot of clients who do well with videos, you know, not hour-long recorded trainings, but like 2-3 minute short videos that show how do you complete a specific thing and what's the benefit of doing it that way. Like I mentioned, right, the training shouldn't stop. So refresher sessions are a really great way to keep people engaged with what's going on. A lot of people do this in the format of lunch and learns. If folks are willing to give up their lunch to learn something new, that's a really great way. And then lastly, in a little bit, we're going to mention the concept of a champion. Your champions should be part of your feedback loop here. Your champions should be people who you can use to help get feedback on how the training is going. Are there things that people are complaining about or uncomfortable doing? Leverage them for your training and leverage them kind of as your eyes and ears on the ground to make sure that, you know, the goals of the project, the goals of your Salesforce implementation are being fully met. So last for me is tip number 5. And this is probably my favorite. And tip number 5 is to make it fun, right? This Salesforce and all technology can seem so daunting. But at the end of the day, right, it's really about efficiency. It's about doing our jobs well. It's about making things easy for ourselves in a lot of ways. So launching a new Salesforce org, launching a new project should be a joyous moment. A couple of things that I really love to do to make it fun is, one is a launch party, right? If you're really launching something that's transformational for a department or transformational for your organization, give it a party, right? Everybody loves, a cool, sexy demo and some pizza and, a little bit of a break. Really helps celebrate and make sure that everybody understands that this moment is momentous, right? That things are about to get really exciting with all the new visibility and collaboration and tools that Salesforce has to offer for your team. Second, I would suggest a little friendly competition, especially if you're working with sales guys or salespeople who are often naturally competitive anyway, right? A little friendly competition often helps people, get there faster, right? So things like prizes for, the first person to enter a certain kind of a record, or maybe a special prize for the first person to close an opportunity in Salesforce, or a prize for the person who creates the most new leads or converts the first lead. There's lots of moments there where you can incentivize people doing things in Salesforce. A common one that we do here at CRM Science is we do pushes for the most trailhead badges. I know Pamela has a few hundred, which is very impressive, and I hope to have as many as she does someday. But again, right, it's a little nice friendly competition between the two of us. And lastly, right, it's really important that you integrate Salesforce into your workspace. And there's some tools here that make that fun also. Two that I really love. One is called Hoopla and another is called Level 11. Both of them allow you to kind of create that ring the bell moment on screens in your workspace. So if you have, a co-located team and they want to see leaderboards, or they want to see when somebody wins an opportunity, right? A tool like Hoopla or Level 11 can help you put up screens in your office, right? And give you that ring the bell moment. Both of those tools are really fun and exciting. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Phil to talk a little bit about user experience and user adoption.
Thanks, Eliza. So, of course, if we want to increase user adoption, we need to consider the user experience, right? So if we want users to adopt the system, they need to have a reason. So with that being said, the tools and process should work together, and they should solve real problems. So often as design trends shift, it's argued, is it form over function, or is it function over form? The truth is that form should support function, and users won't adopt a system if it's not intuitive, but they'll abandon it if it doesn't empower them. So we need to find a perfect balance there. It's a good strategy to first identify the most important problems to solve, especially if the launch is time sensitive or if it's in phases. We want to ensure the initial launch solves the most important business objectives. Even though it's tempting to work on the most exciting features first, we need to keep minimum viable product in mind. This way we won't be stuck with missing critical functionality at launch. And also, don't just create the old system in Salesforce. This is a chance to make many improvements that stakeholders or users have been craving. And finally, consider your mobile strategy. Think about which features are a necessity for all platforms, how they will function, and also be careful of any customization, because sometimes it might function unexpectedly on different devices. So tip number 7, uncover your barriers to adoption. So what are some barriers that can erode or prevent excitement about Salesforce? And these might not always be obvious in the middle of a project. This is an area where CRM Science can offer you tremendous value and expertise based on our years of experience with many users. But one of the biggest excitement killers is bad data. To combat this, we should ask ourselves, what checks are in place to ensure the data is clean going in? Garbage in, garbage out, right? And also, are there any processes that can be automated to avoid human error? Another common barrier is missing critical functionality. That is, the functionality that users need to actually do their work on a day-to-day basis. The best way to avoid missing these features is to plan ahead of time. And of course, lingo matters. So any confusion from unfamiliar terms, that can contribute to a lack of user enthusiasm. Consistency and simple language are the cornerstones of the user experience. Salesforce has a myriad of standard objects, but it could be confusing for new users if your organization uses different terms than the Salesforce standard. For example, projects versus programs. And bugs. Bugs are a huge adoption killer. Oh, I skipped one, sorry. Lack of transparency. Be transparent by communicating clearly and often, as Eliza said. Communication, communication, communication. Learning a new system, or anything for that matter, takes repetition. It might take 7 times, as Eliza suggested. So we want to make sure that we're using multiple methods of communication: verbal, written, reminders, signs around the building, etc. And now we can talk about bugs. Bugs are a huge adoption killer. Nobody wants to use a buggy system. So how do we avoid this? We can avoid bugs with lots of testing. Give testing the time it deserves. This is an area that's often overlooked or just under budgeted. And also consider a soft launch with targeted users before a full rollout, possibly with your champions, as Pamela will get into. Make training appealing to all skill levels. So even if the training is mandatory, user adoption will be higher with engaging training. And of course, keep gathering user feedback to discover any other barriers. And now I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Pamela.
Thanks, Phil. So one of the things we talked about is the importance of finding your champions. So let's think about, who are they? They rarely have a sign on their back saying, hey, I'm your champion. How do we recognize them? Well, often these are people that are on the Salesforce team and they lead by example. They use Salesforce. They're enthusiastic and passionate about using Salesforce, and they understand the business why behind using it as a system. They're often folks on the front line that do the actual work that Salesforce is supporting or is designed to support. People like your salespeople, your customer service reps, etc. However, sometimes champions can be people that are not frontline users or not on the Salesforce team. They may not be your super users, but they are people who are involved in tangential systems or processes, and they're interested in how Salesforce integrates with their team or their work. So how do we recognize our super users? They're people who lead by example by using the system. They also make their support of Salesforce visible. Now, how do they do this? It might be that in meetings or communications, they are asking for or using data from Salesforce. They're not using Excel spreadsheets in meetings. They keep visibility high, and if other people are using alternative methods for bringing data to a meeting, they might call that out and specifically say, hey, this is an opportunity for us to be using Salesforce. Another thing to look for champions are those who are informal thought leaders in your organization. These are people who either have long tenure, who may be very seasoned in the business, but they have the ability, whether formal or informal, to influence others and their perception of the value of Salesforce. So bringing them on board as your champion is really helpful. Alternatively, you could look to some of those folks who are apprehensive about bringing Salesforce into the organization or who may be early naysayers. And those could be people that if you meet with one-on-one and really dig in and listen to their concerns, that you could sway to be one of your champions. And that can be very powerful in leading others to adoption. Now, once you've identified your champions, what is it that you want to do with them? Well, there are 3 things. One is, as mentioned earlier, involve them early in the process. You can never involve these folks early enough. As someone mentioned, you could have them participate in a soft launch, for example. You can gather feedback from these folks. As we mentioned, they may be people on the front line doing the actual work. They can help you identify what are those critical requirements for launch. You can have a number of different methodologies to gather their feedback. It often depends on the size of your organization, the location of these folks. It could be surveys, it could be shadowing them one-on-one as they do their work, it could be small group meetings or workshops. And then the third thing is you want to empower these folks to help others in the organization. So that may involve coordinating with their manager so that you can align their workload expectations to make sure they're available. You want to be able to recognize them publicly for helping others. And it's also a carrot for their own career growth and leadership opportunity for folks who may have traditionally been individual contributors to the organization. So let's look now at tip number 9. As we think about deploying the system, we want to make sure we close the loop. This can actually help drive further adoption later on. And we're looking at a system here called Build, Measure, and this is really a wonderful way to think about what are we doing on an ongoing basis to maintain the system that we've built and to evolve it over time. The exciting part about Salesforce is that it can change and evolve over time to meet your users' needs. And likewise, the dangerous part of Salesforce is that it can change easily over time. So you want to make sure you're always keeping an eye on it, monitoring it to make sure it's meeting your users' needs and not straying away from that core functionality. 2 books that we really recommend are The Lean Startup and Lean Six Sigma to help dive into this process a little bit more. But first, we're going to look at build. Build and build your system, but also build in terms of building trust in the organization with your Salesforce implementation. How do we build trust? We get it right the first time. So this gets to things like we don't have a lot of bugs. We make sure we have the right functionality in place. We have that minimum viable product. The second way that we build trust is that we follow through. When we get feedback from people, we follow through on that. Part of doing that means listening well. So how do we ensure that we're building trust and listening well? Well, we put feedback systems in place. So we always have a way for users to let us know their feedback. As we mentioned, you might do that through holding sessions with your users periodically, and you've generated, as Eliza mentioned, some of those reports that you've defined that are going to show you bugs or usage or issues that are areas within Salesforce that are not being used very frequently. And finally, once we build trust and we listen, it's really important to respond well. Not just respond, but respond well. So mechanisms to help us do that include having a dedicated team who knows that it's their job to respond to the feedback we're getting, to make sure that questions are welcomed, that we're not shaming our users for asking questions, we're not feeling like there's any silly or dumb questions being asked. And finally, that we have patience with repetition of questions. It's natural that people are going to ask and ask again and ask again, and we need to really respond well by being patient with our users. Not everyone is a tech wizard or loves a new tech system. So the way that we respond can really help drive user adoption. And finally, tip number 10, have a sunsetting plan. So as Eliza mentioned earlier, this means we don't let old systems hang around. It's very clear that Salesforce is the new game in town, and that's what we're using. We have a cutover date that makes it clear when other systems will disappear. We don't want to encourage people to have workarounds. When we're communicating about the benefits of Salesforce, we're really speaking in terms of benefits in the language of our users. We're painting vivid pictures. We're using storytelling. We're doing it from a business perspective as well as a user system perspective. We're really painting that picture of how Salesforce is going to improve their work, improve their flexibility, save people time. And then I think another part of this is the soft side of change management, which is change is hard, and for many people, change is scary. So calling out fears explicitly for our users and saying, hey, you may be afraid of this, you may be worried about that, and having a well-planned response to some of those fears. Oftentimes people feel like if you understand their feelings, then they feel heard, then they're more open to trying something new. So recognize that those fears may be in your organization and speak to those clearly and with understanding and empathy that it's difficult. So now we'll do a quick recap of what those 10, oh, I'm sorry, let me just mention here, it's often the case that productivity goes down slightly before it goes up when you're in the midst of a change. So I think acknowledging that for people and making them feel like it's a safe space to see their productivity go down a bit before it goes back up helps people not be as scared about change. Now we're going to do a quick recap. These are the 10 actionable steps that we've offered you today. We hope you'll keep this list handy and that find it helpful. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Diana.
Thank you, Pamela, and thanks, Eliza and Phil, for sharing your tips as well. I know we're at time and we might have some questions, but really want to make sure that all of you know how to get connected with us. If you haven't talked to us before, the easiest way to reach out is through our website. We have a contact form there. We have live chat as well. Live chat connects you to Leah and Rob, who are on our sales team and always available. And then if you're on social media, follow us. We are on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and are also very responsive there. Next, I want to talk about our next webinar real quick. We don't have a date yet, but we're looking to host this webinar in September. Phil, earlier today, he shared some of his tips around user adoption and user experience, but on our next webinar, he will be diving deeper into that and how to really design Salesforce with your user's experience in mind. All right, so with that, let's take a look. I know we're at time again, but let's take a look if we have questions. Nope. Eliza, are you still muted? Okay, let me unmute you. And I don't see any questions.
Hey, Diana, I'm seeing one, which is, these are all great tips. So where do most projects fail and which tips are least followed with the greatest impact?
So one of the common ones that I see there is that folks train once and then they're done, right? The use of multiple trainings or the use of, those multiple touch points often doesn't get done because a highly technical team is often focused on just the technical pieces, and that change management strategy is often something that falls off pretty quickly.
Great. We have another question in, which is, what is the most common occurrence in Salesforce where user adoption is continuously brought up?
I think so, and Pamela, I'd love your thoughts on this too. I think one of the biggest impacts of bad user adoption is often for sales teams who are using Salesforce to measure their pipeline. If folks aren't, engaged in the system, using Salesforce to gather the information or can hold the information about their accounts, contacts, and opportunities, and their pipeline isn't accurate, and it's very hard to have good conversations about what's coming to the business.
Where's the best place to vote for or suggest upcoming webinar topics? So we will actually be sending out a survey later on where we will point that out. Any more questions before we wrap up? Eliza, Pamela, Phil, anything you'd like to add before we end the webinar today in regards to the topics that we've covered?
No, I really appreciate everybody's time today. I really hope that we've offered some helpful insight for everyone, and I hope folks join for our next one.
Yeah, and like I said before, we'll make sure that everyone receives the replay as well as these slides. So look out for that email either later today or tomorrow. And then, yeah, thanks everyone for joining. We appreciate your time, and hopefully we will see you next time. Take care.